This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chet Chris, London, UK. Nicholas Nickleby, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 8 of the Internal Economy of Dotheboys Hall. A ride of 200 and odd miles in severe weather is one of the best softeners of a hard bed that ingenuity can devise. Perhaps it is even a sweetener of dreams, for those which hovered over the rough couch of Nicholas, and whispered their airy nothings in his ear, were of an agreeable and happy kind. He was making his fortune very fast indeed, when the faint glimmer of an expiring candle shone before his eyes, and a voice he had no difficulty in recognising as part and parcel of Mr. Squeers, admonished him that it was time to rise. "Past 7, Nickleby," said Mr. Squeers. "Has morning come already?" asked Nicholas, sitting up in bed. "Ah, that has it," replied Squeers, "and ready iced too. Now, Nickleby, come, tumble up, will you?" Nicholas needed no further admonition, but tumbled up at once, and proceeded to dress himself by the light of the taper which Mr. Squeers carried in his hand. "Here's a pretty go," said that gentleman. "The pump's froze." "Indeed," said Nicholas, not much interested in the intelligence. "Yes," replied Squeers. "You can't wash yourself this morning." "Not wash myself!" exclaimed Nicholas. "No, not a bit of it," rejoined Squeers tartly. "So you must be content with giving yourself a dry polish till we break the ice in the well, and you can get a bucketful out for the boys. Don't stand staring at me, but do look sharp, will you?" Offering no further observation, Nicholas huddled on his clothes. Squeers meanwhile opened the shutters and blew the candle out, when the voice of his amiable consort was heard in the passage, demanding admittance. "Come in, my love," said Squeers. Mrs. Squeers came in, still habited in the primitive night jacket which had displayed the symmetry of her figure on the previous night, and further ornamented with a beaver bonnet of some antiquity, which she wore with much ease and lightness on the top of the nightcap before mentioned. "Drat the things," said the lady, opening the cupboard. "I can't find the school spoon anywhere." "Never mind it, my dear," observed Squeers in a soothing manner. "It's of no consequence." "No consequence! Why, how you talk!" retorted Mrs. Squeers sharply. "Isn't it brimstone morning?" "I forgot, my dear," rejoined Squeers. "Yes, it certainly is. We purify the boys' bloods now and then, Nickleby." "Purify fiddlestick's ends," said his lady. "Don't think, young man, that we go to the expense of flour and brimstone and molasses just to purify them, because if you think we carry on the business in that way, you'll find yourself mistaken, and so I tell you plainly." "My dear," said Squeers, frowning. "Oh, nonsense," rejoined Mrs. Squeers. "If the young man comes to be a teacher here, let him understand at once that we don't want any foolery about the boys. They have the brimstone and treacle, partly because if they hadn't something or other in the way of medicine, they'd be always ailing and giving a world of trouble, and partly because it spoils their appetites and comes cheaper than breakfast and dinner. So it does them good and us good at the same time, and that's fair enough, I'm sure." Having given this explanation, Mrs. Squeers put her head into the closet and instituted a stricter search after the spoon, in which Mr. Squeers assisted. A few words passed between them while they were thus engaged, but as their voices were partially stifled by the cupboard, all that Nicholas could distinguish was that Mr. Squeers said what Mrs. Squeers had said was injudicious, and that Mrs. Squeers said what Mr. Squeers said was stuff. A vast deal of searching and rummaging ensued, and it proving fruitless, Smike was called in, and pushed by Mrs. Squeers, and boxed by Mr. Squeers, which course of treatment brightening his intellects, enabled him to suggest that possibly Mrs. Squeers might have the spoon in her pocket, as indeed turned out to be the case. As Mrs. Squeers had previously protested, however, that she was quite certain she had not got it, Smike received another box on the ear for presuming to contradict his mistress, together with the promise of a sound thrashing if he were not more respectful in future, so that he took nothing very advantageous by his motion. "A most invaluable woman, that Nickleby," said Squeers, when his consort had hurried away, pushing the drudge before her. "Indeed, sir," observed Nicholas. "I don't know her equal," said Squeers. "I do not know her equal. That woman, Nickleby, is always the same bustling, lively, active, saving creature that you see her now." Nicholas sighed involuntarily at the thought of the agreeable domestic prospect thus opened to him, but Squeers was fortunately too much occupied with his own reflections to perceive it. "It's my way to say, when I'm up in London," continued Squeers, "that to them boys she's a mother. But she's more than a mother to them, 10 times more. She does things for them boys, Nickleby, that I don't believe half the mothers going would do for their own sons." "I should think they would not, sir," answered Nicholas. Now the fact was, that both Mr. and Mrs. Squeers viewed the boys in the light of their proper and natural enemies; or, in other words, they held and considered that their business and profession was to get as much from every boy as could by possibility be screwed out of him. On this point they were both agreed, and behaved in unison accordingly. The only difference between them was, that Mrs. Squeers waged war against the enemy openly and fearlessly, and that Squeers covered his rascality, even at home, with a spice of his habitual deceit, as if he really had a notion of some day or other being able to take himself in, and persuade his own mind that he was a very good fellow. "But come," said Squeers, interrupting the progress of some thoughts to this effect in the mind of his usher, "let's go to the schoolroom, and lend me a hand with my school coat, will you?" Nicholas assisted his master to put on an old fustian shooting jacket, which he took down from a peg in the passage, and Squeers, arming himself with his cane, led the way across a yard to a door in the rear of the house. "There," said the schoolmaster, as they stepped in together, "this is our shop, Nickleby." It was such a crowded scene, and there were so many objects to attract attention, that at first Nicholas stared about him, really without seeing anything at all. By degrees, however, the place resolved itself into a bare and dirty room, with a couple of windows, whereof a 10th part might be of glass, the remainder being stopped up with old copybooks and paper. There were a couple of long old rickety desks, cut and notched and inked and damaged in every possible way; 2 or 3 forms; a detached desk for Squeers, and another for his assistant. The ceiling was supported like that of a barn by crossbeams and rafters, and the walls were so stained and discoloured that it was impossible to tell whether they had ever been touched with paint or whitewash. But the pupils, the young noblemen! How the last faint traces of hope, the remotest glimmering of any good to be derived from his efforts in this den, faded from the mind of Nicholas as he looked in dismay around. Pale and haggard faces, lank and bony figures, children with the countenances of old men, deformities with irons upon their limbs, boys of stunted growth, and others whose long meagre legs would hardly bear their stooping bodies, all crowded on the view together. There were the bleared eye, the hare lip, the crooked foot, and every ugliness or distortion that told of unnatural aversion conceived by parents for their offspring, or of young lives which, from the earliest dawn of infancy, had been one horrible endurance of cruelty and neglect. There were little faces which should have been handsome, darkened with the scowl of sullen, dogged suffering. There was childhood with the light of its eye quenched, its beauty gone, and its helplessness alone remaining. There were vicious faced boys brooding with leaden eyes, like malefactors in a jail; and there were young creatures on whom the sins of their frail parents had descended, weeping even for the mercenary nurses they had known, and lonesome even in their loneliness. With every kindly sympathy and affection blasted in its birth, with every young and healthy feeling flogged and starved down, with every revengeful passion that can fester in swollen hearts eating its evil way to their core in silence, what an incipient hell was breeding here! And yet this scene, painful as it was, had its grotesque features, which, in a less interested observer than Nicholas, might have provoked a smile. Mrs. Squeers